In the summer of 1957, the newspapers of a newly established state of Israel ran a photograph that confused a lot of people. It showed David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, the man who had declared the state 9 years earlier, the architect of its military and institutions, a man in his early 70s standing on his head on a beach in Herzliya in his bathing suit, perfectly upright and apparently unconcerned about the world watching him from every angle. Ben-Gurion had called the press himself and had not told the man responsible for the whole thing, who found out about it when he opened the afternoon newspaper and saw the now famous photograph alongside his own name. The man was Moshe Feldenkrais, and this is the story of how a Ukrainian-born physicist who worked on nuclear research in Paris and anti-submarine technology in Scotland ended up teaching the first Prime Minister of Israel to stand on his head. Moshe Feldenkrais was born in 1904 in Slavuta in what is now Ukraine. His family moved to Baranovich in present-day Belarus when he was 8. He received his bar mitzvah there in 1918, while the town was actively changing hands between warring armies in the last convulsions of the World War I. By the time the war ended, he had already decided to leave. He was 13 years old at the time. He walked out of Eastern Europe with a satchel and spent 6 months making his way to what was at the time called the Ottoman district of Damascus, arriving in December 1919. He first worked in construction, building what will become modern-day Tel Aviv. He practiced jiu-jitsu and developed his own self-defense system, which he taught to the Jewish self-defense organization operating under the British mandate, Holt Haganah. There, he put himself through high school and earned a diploma in his early 20s. Then he moved to Paris. In France, he enrolled in the École des Travaux Publics, graduated in 1933 with specialties in mechanical and electrical engineering, and then began a doctorate in physics at the Sorbonne while working as a research assistant under Frédéric Joliot-Curie, the physicist who would go on to win the Nobel Prize in chemistry at the Radium Institute. He was, by any measure, a serious scientist in a serious laboratory at the frontier of nuclear research. At almost the same moment, a book he had written on jiu-jitsu a few years back caught the attention of a group of Japanese who were trying to establish judo in France. The book was technically rigorous enough that they tracked down its author and offered to train him in judo personally, on the condition that he helps them build the sport present in Europe. Through this, Feldenkrais meets Jigoro Kano, the Japanese educator and martial artist who had founded Modern Judo in 1882. Kano was then in his 70s, still traveling internationally to promote his creation. He was impressed enough with Feldenkrais that he wanted him specifically as the conduit for bringing judo to France. Feldenkrais earned his black belt in 1936 and founded the first judo club in France, the Jiu-Jitsu Club de France, which still exists today. At the time, when Germans arrived to France in 1940, he had a doctorate he couldn't officially claim yet because the war had disrupted the bureaucratic process. A judo club, a wife, Yona Rubinstein, a pediatrician he had known since childhood, and a research position in nuclear physics in one of the most important laboratories in Europe. He had to escape from Paris carrying heavy suitcases of secret documents from the Radium Institute. It was only discovered later that these documents contained, among other things, instructions for making phosphorus bombs. He handed them to the British Admiralty, who took him as a scientific officer and sent him to Scotland to work on anti-submarine weapons technology for the duration of the war. It was in Scotland, working on submarines, that he acquired a serious knee injury. The knee had been bothering him for years. He had originally injured it in a football match back in 1929. The injury recurred during his escape from France, aggravated by the physical demands of the flight and then by walking on the wet, rolling decks of submarines in Scotland. By the mid-1940s, it was severe enough to be genuinely disabling. Surgeons recommended an operation, but Feldenkrais, applying his scientific judgment to the available evidence, concluding that the surgery had a poor probability of success, given the state of orthopedic medicine at the time. Instead, he started working on it himself. What he did over the following months and years is worth understanding in some detail, because it was not rehabilitation in any conventional sense. He did not do strengthening exercises that were the staple of recovery at the time. What he did was lie on the floor for hours and move his knee in increments so small they were barely perceptible, paying close and sustained attention to where exactly the sensation changed and what happened in the rest of the body when he moved the joint in one direction versus the other. He was not trying to fix the knee but to understand what is happening in his body, and in this process he noticed something that seemed obvious once he saw it, but that had not been part of how he thought about movement before. The knee was not the problem in any isolated sense. The entire pattern of how he used himself had been organized around the knee injury for years, and that organization has been reinforcing the issue. The nervous system had learned to protect the injury by recruiting the rest of the body into a compensatory pattern, so that pattern had become the default. He realized that the knee might heal or not heal, but the pattern would remain regardless. By teaching his nervous system a different way of organizing the whole, he eventually restored enough function to continue practicing judo and to walk without pain. And this recovery was not due to the fixing of a mechanical problem in the knee joint. He wrote later that he had failed to solve the mechanical problem but managed to revitalize the function. That distinction between fixing a part and changing a pattern became the foundation of the work he developed later. By the time the Second World War ended, Feldenkrais had begun articulating what was happening in those long sessions on the floor. At the beginning, he gave lectures to colleagues in the Admiralty and ran experiment classes there. That was how he started writing what would become the first book about movement, published in London in 1949 under the title Body and Mature Behavior, a study of anxiety, sex, gravity, and the relationship between posture and psychological state. The book was revolutionary. It drew on mechanics, neurophysiology, developmental psychology, and the work of several thinkers whose ideas were circulating through the alternative intellectual culture of the period. People like Gurdjieff, his ideas about unconscious behavior patterns, the Alexander work on relationship between posture and function, and William Bates' unorthodox theories about vision. Feldenkrais was synthesizing across fields in a way that made the book difficult to categorize and therefore easy to ignore by a single discipline. What he was arguing, in essence, was that the nervous system is the primary organizing principle of how the body moves and learns in general. In infancy, the learning happens by exploring movements freely, discovering what works through trial and repetition without anyone correcting it. It is in this exploratory phase that the deepest and most resilient patterns are established, the basic relationship between environment and directed movement. But then the child enters a social world that imposes corrections on his behavior. The developing nervous system, trying to manage all of this, begins to organize around these pressures rather than purely around functional efficiency. Tensions get built into the body's default resting state, forming tensions and compensatory patterns. And eventually, the adult moves through the world carrying a nervous system whose organization was shaped as much by what was psychologically demanded of it as by what was biomechanically optimal. Moshe realized that this could not be undone through willpower or instruction because the patterns operated below the level of conscious control, but it might be approachable through slow, attentive, exploratory movement. The same way the nervous system learned in the first place, through discovering rather than being told. He called the two modes of working that emerged from this: awareness through movement and functional integration. The first was group work, verbally guided movement sequences performed slowly with sustained attention, typically lying on the floor, exploring variations of simple actions in ways that gradually revealed habitual patterns and offered alternatives. The second was individual hands-on work in which the practitioner used gentle touch and guided movement not to manipulate tissue but to communicate with the nervous system, to offer it information about how parts of the body relate to each other. Possibilities the person couldn't access on their own because the default organization blocked the perception. Moshe made a very deliberate distinction in how he called the sessions. They were lessons and not treatments. His rationale was that the treatment implies a pathology being corrected by an expert, when a lesson implies a learning process in which the practitioner is a teacher and the nervous system is the student. He returned to Israel in the early 50s as the invitation of Ben-Gurion, who wanted him to direct the Israeli Army's Department of Electronics. He spent a few years in that role, then moved permanently to Tel Aviv and began teaching his movement method full-time from a studio on Alexander Yanai Street. He gave individual sessions in the apartment where his mother and brother lived. In 1956, Ben-Gurion was suffering from severe pain that had laid him up in bed during the lead-up to the Sinai campaign. Every physician in Israel had been consulted, but nothing had worked. Scientist Nest Abraham Katzir suggested the physicist, who also happened to have unusual ideas about the body. Ben-Gurion, running a military operation from his bed, agreed to see him. Feldenkrais arrived, examining him, and said, "You will need 70 lessons, but if you haven't committed to attending the last one, don't start with the first." Ben-Gurion agreed to those terms. Within a month, the pain was gone. They continued working together, and Feldenkrais told Ben-Gurion something that had less to do with back pain. The prime minister was a man of enormous intellectual and political capability who had consistently neglected his own body, and that neglect was a kind of limitation, a dimension of his capacities that remained undeveloped. Moshe suggested that Ben-Gurion learn to do a headstand, not for any athletic reason, but because doing something the body believed was impossible was a way of changing this limiting assumption. They worked on it for roughly 2 years. In small steps, because Moshe believed that the nervous system does not respond well to force or urgency. When Ben-Gurion could finally do it, he called the newspapers himself without telling Feldenkrais, went to the beach at 6 in the morning and put his head down on the sand in front of the cameras. The photograph ran everywhere. Ben-Gurion reportedly said that he had to stand on his head so the state of Israel could stand on his feet. His wife, Paula, less impressed, referred to Feldenkrais privately as Mr. Hocus Pocus. These two different responses, the prime minister conviction that something real had happened, and his wife's suspicion that it was all theater, track something that has followed the Feldenkrais method ever since. The results that practitioners and students describe are often significant, and the explanatory framework underneath them is generally original. The scientific validation, however, has come slowly and partially, enough to establish that the method produces real effects, but not enough to fully account for the mechanisms. In the decades since Feldenkrais developed his ideas, the emergent field of neuroscience confirmed the principle his whole method was built on: the brain changes in response to experience. The term neuroplasticity, describing the nervous system's capacity to reorganize itself through life in response to learning, injury, and practice, was not in common use in the Feldenkrais times. He was working from his own observations and from the neurophysiology available in the mid-20th century, which was substantially less detailed than what exists now. But the core claim he was making, that the nervous system is a dynamic learning system that continuously reorganizes itself based on experience, is now well established. Today, it is a common knowledge that the motor cortex maps and remaps, that sensory representation change with use and neglect, and that patterns established in early life can be modified by sustained alternative learning in adulthood. It was confirmed that the brain, in other words, does exactly what Feldenkrais said it did, based solely on his observations. What remains less certain is precisely how a lesson produces the changes it produces. When someone comes in with chronic shoulder tension that has been present for 15 years, receives a 30-minute functional integration session, and leaves moving their arm in a way that was not available to them before, what exactly happened? It is clear that the tissue did not change in 30 minutes, but that something in the organization of the system shifted and the movement that was previously blocked became available. Neuroscientists who have engaged seriously with the method, like Oliver Sacks, Norman Doidge, or Michael Merzenich, have found it compelling and consistent with what is known about how the brain works. The clinical evidence base is growing, but still limited by the difficulty of designing rigorous studies around a method that is explicitly individualized and hard to standardize. Feldenkrais, who would have found the demand for standardization philosophically objectionable, once said, "I have no stereotypical technique that I apply invariably to everyone. This is against the principles of my theory. The nervous system of each person is a unique product of their specific history, and learning must be organized in response to the specific system, not applied according to a protocol." That position is what makes the method harder to study and easier to dismiss. In the late 60s and through the 70s, Feldenkrais Feldenkrais began presenting his work internationally, finding audiences in Europe and the United States that the Israeli context has not provided. He ran teacher training programs in San Francisco and later in Amherst, Massachusetts. He lectured in Esalen, where he met the same alternative culture of practitioners and thinkers that Ida Rolf had encountered a decade earlier. He worked with performers, musicians, athletes, and people with neurological conditions for whom conventional rehabilitation has reached its limits. One of the cases he described and documented most carefully was a woman he called Nora, a stroke patient who had lost the ability to read and write, who came to him after neurologists had conducted that she reached the maximum possible recovery. He worked with her over many sessions, moving her hands and fingers through patterns related to writing, having her trace letters with her eyes closed, building connections between movement and perception through the carefully crafted lessons that he came up with on the spot. After an extended period of work, Nora recovered the ability to read and write. Feldenkrais wrote about the case in a book published in 1977, pointedly titled The Case of Nora. Whether the recovery was caused by lessons or whether it represented natural neurological recovery that coincided with the lessons is impossible to establish with certainty from a single case. However, this case had something to show about what the nervous system is capable of when approached through exploration rather than through correction, and it was being said years before neurological rehabilitation began systematically exploring what is now called neuroplasticity-based therapy. Feldenkrais suffered a subdural hematoma in 1981 after the second summer of his Amherst training, a bleed on the brain that was probably related to an old injuries from his judo and fighting years, as the neurosurgeon who operated on him noted. He never fully recovered his capacity to teach. Moshe published his last book, The Elusive Obvious, that same year, and died in Tel Aviv in July 1984. He was 80 years old. He left behind over 1,000 recorded movement lessons, both in English and Hebrew, a trade community of practitioners working on every continent, and a set of ideas about movement and learning that neuroscience has spent the subsequent 4 decades gradually confirming and has not finished with yet. What is striking, looking back at the full arc of his life, is how consistently the biography and the ideas mirror each other. He was always acting from the same underlying conviction that the human system, given the right condition, can find its way to possibilities that seem closed. He was an engineer and a physicist who applied the same rigor to studying movement that he had applied to anti-submarine technology and judo. The gentlessness of the method is deceiving, but in it lies the essence of it. The slowness of the movements is the speed in which the nervous system actually learns, as opposed to the speed in which it performs. Someone once asked him what he actually was teaching. He said that he wasn't teaching people better movement, he was teaching better to know what they're doing.